We're here already, but people may be grabbing a drink, so I will start talking slowly as you're filing in. And for those of you with an astute eye, you may have noticed that there's been some interesting wireless news in the last couple of hours, and thus the reporter from the Wall Street Journal, Drew Fitzgerald, who was going to moderate this panel, is unable to make it, but he sent me his questions. So I will be playing the role of Drew Fitzgerald today, and thank you for your patience. But I think we'll just give people a moment to get their coffee and come sit down. And as a reminder to you all, this panel will focus on unlicensed and shared spectrum as investment catalysts. So we are so pleased to have joining us Brian Regan with Starry, Brent Skorup with the Mercatus Center, Dave Wright with Ruckus Wireless, and Michael Calabrese with the Wireless Future Project at New America. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon.
You gotta start the school day at the beginning.
Good afternoon, Mr. Wright. So first of all, thank you all for your patience. Thanks for joining us. I'm actually pretty excited to get to play the role of Drew Fitzgerald today, because when we were having our prep call, I said, I want to talk about money. And so now I get to. And you all get to answer the questions. So what if we just start with maybe 30 seconds of who you are and what your interest is, sort of where you sit on this panel. We'll start with you.
Sure, thanks. I'm Brian Regan. I'm with Starry Incorporated. I do legal policy and strategy for them, including on spectrum strategy. For those who don't know Starry, we are a fixed wireless broadband startup. We're pretty unique in that we are both designing our own network, developing our own equipment from base station transceiver to in-home broadband router, and we are a service provider using the unlicensed ecosystem in two ways. One is in 802.11 chipsets, which we upconvert to lightly licensed millimeter wave frequencies that we can talk more about later on in this panel.
Great, thank you. Brent.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My name is Brent Skorup. I'm at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and I'm just interested in wireless policy, and at Mercatus we kind of have our foot in the academic world and the policy world, and spectrum has been for decades a rich area of study for economists and property scholars, and studying institutions and rule of law and property rights and the commons, and it's fascinating. And you see at the FCC, economists and academics do have an influence on spectrum policy, and 3.5, 3.6. I mean, there's a lot of issues here, and it's a fascinating area to study. The FCC has been a policy innovator for a long time. Unlicensed is part of that. Spectrum auctions is part of that. But there is such thing as too much of a good thing, and I think we might have that with 3.5.
Good afternoon, Dave Wright with Ruckus. I was already asked a few times before we got started. So Ruckus, we're currently a business unit of Brocade, and after a few announced corporate transitions, if everything works out as planned, we'll be a part of Eris here shortly. So I do regulatory and standards for Ruckus. Our interest in Wi-Fi and unlicensed spectrum is pretty straightforward, I hope. We're we are the lead provider of service provider Wi-Fi solutions and one of the leaders in enterprise Wi-Fi. More recently, I'll go into some more details, but we've made significant investments in the CBRS band. We believe that the open aspects of CBRS, both at the PAL and the GA tier, essentially allow the opportunity for LTE services to be deployed at a cost model, and also with the complexity more associated with Wi-Fi than with traditional cellular systems. So we've made significant investments there, and happy to be here to talk to you about it. Thanks.
Michael Calabrese, I direct the Wireless Future Program at New America's Open Technology Institute. Here in Washington, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, policy institute, and I've been tilling these spectrum fields for many years, mainly trying to open more bands for unlicensed use, and a bit more recently, like particularly the last 5 years, for more dynamic shared spectrum, since we're running out of bands that are clean to reallocate. So along those lines, I helped to write the PCAST report back in 2012, and I serve on the Commerce Spectrum Advisory Committee, CSMAC. But I've just, have a pretty big focus on unlicensed Wi-Fi and shared spectrum.
Great, thank you. So Brian, I'll start with you, and I think if people in the audience are like me, they went and they signed up on Starry's site, like get updates. Could you update us on your deployment in Boston?
Sure, thanks very much. So Starry has launched in Boston our fixed wireless broadband service. We are currently operating under an experimental authority from the FCC, waiting for some rules to be finalized at the Commission on spectrum sharing in the 37 to 37.6 gigahertz band. In the interim, we do have an opportunity to test our technology, to test our business model in a number of cities across the country. We've started in Boston now. We've got a number of customers signed up. We've got base station locations deployed throughout the city. And what's a little unique is that we are essentially a fixed 5G service. We're one of the first ones probably in the world to really launch at some scale in a city with customers. And the opportunity really is to test out how our technology works. As I mentioned, we developed this from the ground up. It's 802.11 baseband radios that we've upconverted to millimeter wave spectrum, which gives us the capacity of 802.11ax. As Gabe was mentioning on the last panel, you've got 5 gigabits per second in the current generation, 20 gigabits per second plus in the next generation. So we're able to offer a really high quality broadband service that's much like fiber, but do it at a dramatic reduction of cost relative to fiber. So we're in Boston now, perhaps a couple of additional cities this year. We're hoping to ramp up pretty quickly over the next few years.
Okay, thank you. Both I and as a person interested in this space and as a consumer, very interested in that description. So you mentioned cost per bit, right? And it seems like that's probably something that the first panel danced around a little bit. It's something that I imagine drives some investment decisions. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, but also maybe Dave and Brent and Michael, if this is something you want to weigh in on. I think it's all related to whether we're in a spectrum crunch or not, both licensed and unlicensed, and kind of as a scene setter for the market that we're talking about. Tell me a little bit about cost per bit and what that means for your business.
Sure. So I'll kick it off and then welcome thoughts from you guys. So when Starry was founded a few years ago, the founders recognized a problem, and it's sort of a common problem in the WISP origin story, which is that they realized there was a lack of competitive broadband. The difference between the way Starry perceived it and the way other WISPs perceive it is that they viewed that on a global scale, not on just a local scale. So they took a step back and thought about ways to solve that problem. Fixed infrastructure is incredibly expensive. Fiber is incredibly expensive to deploy. It's hard to enter the market on a competitive basis. It's doubly hard to enter the market on a competitive basis when you're venture-backed and not a big incumbent, right? So I thought about different ways to solve that problem, realized wireless really was the solution, and thinking about different wireless bands to focus on, millimeter wave really became clear that that was the right band to focus on given the high capacity that you can get in the high-frequency spectrum. And then layering on top of that, the opportunity to get access to the mass market 802.11, decided that was really the path to go to dramatically reduce the cost per bits, essentially. So we are operating in a very small fraction of what it would cost to pass a home. So the metric in sort of fixed broadband terminology is cost per home passed. We are able to do that at a total fraction of the cost of a fixed fiber deployment.
Great. Any other thoughts from, I think, Dave as an established, a slightly more established player in the wireless industry, just than Starry?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. No. Sure, they're going to be very successful. So, I would just mention, I do know that the Wi-Fi Alliance commissioned a report. This came out 3 and a half years ago. I remember I was at a conference in Boston when it was released, but I believe it was by Monica Paolini from Sensafili, and it was actually a sort of a cost per bit on a TCO basis, showing sort of unlicensed spectrum solutions versus licensed spectrum. And as anticipated, it was an order of magnitude less expensive to deliver a bit over unlicensed spectrum than licensed. I think from my perspective, there's a few things that are bound up in that. Certainly the spectrum allocation cost is one, and I think Steve on the previous panel sort of pointed out that one of the opportunities they see, or their WISP constituents see with CBRS, is that if you don't have to spend the money on the spectrum, it's more money you can invest in the network and on service development and offering services to your customers. So I think spectrum cost is certainly bound up in that. I also think it's just a matter of the size and diversity of the ecosystem that comes up. I mean, when we talk about the unlicensed ecosystem now, if Gabriel's still around, I'm sure he's got a lot more of market data on this. But I mean, it's been such a wide variety of use cases, everything from now IoT to consumer to enterprise to service provider, from the home to the office to the public venue and stadiums and places like this, that you just have such a wide range of of industries, of chipset suppliers. Brian was just talking about how they're adapting these chipsets for even other uses. So I think the scale and the size of the ecosystem also helps to drive down the cost, and that's going to be one of the other reasons we've got such a much lower bit per cost per bit.
Sure.
So you mentioned the spectrum crunch, and it's too bad Julius Janikowski isn't here today to tell us why that never happened. In all fairness, I think Chairman Janikowski, it was, his using that spectrum crunch, spectrum crisis at the time, 2009, 2010, it was a political tactic to get Congress to authorize the incentive auction in particular. But when you consider that just ended, we still haven't deployed any of that spectrum, and yet we haven't had the crunch 8 years later. And the reason is Wi-Fi. That Wi-Fi has really taken up, has absorbed that bandwidth. More than 50% year-over-year growth in mobile device data traffic ever since he said that. And we've absorbed it mainly because Wi-Fi is carrying roughly, in US, Western Europe, roughly 80% of the mobile device data traffic. And that sort of connects to the other thing you mentioned, which is cost per bit, which is far cheaper at the edge of the network in a small cell than it is in a large wide area network deployed for mobility. And so, if you think about it, it's almost common sense. Wi-Fi, if you think about how much you spend on Wi-Fi, deploying it on a do-it-yourself basis, whether it's by a business, a hotel, individuals at home in this building, how much you spend using unlicensed spectrum in an off-the-shelf router connected to wireline, like Comcast, that you already pay for anyway. Compare that to the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars that mobile carrier networks need to pay for wide area coverage networks and mobility, which we need. But on a cost per bit basis, as we move closer, as the needs are increasingly for capacity and low latency, the economics will be at the edge of the network in small cells for both carriers and for everybody else.
Sure.
So I'm never quite sure what to do with this cost per bit figure. I mean, it seems pretty different from social value, which is ultimately what you care about. I mean, you can imagine extreme examples where you have, broadcast TV is, it's a business model. They transmit free bits to everyone. That's a very low cost per bit. There's a lot of social value being taken up by that. I mean, you can imagine, a missile detection system that only detects once every 50 years. You might say that's terrible efficiency. That might be the highest and best use of that system. Or FirstNet, might have capacity for public safety. So I think it can mislead in some ways, this cost per bit. I mean, it's interesting when you're comparing, directly comparable services, but spectrum policy on the whole, I think it can mislead. So I don't know what to do with it.
That's but a great kind of opening up the question. That was an interesting way to think about it. So taking that line and that tact, when you've done a lot of work on the underutilization of spectrum, particularly in many cases by federal agencies or by federal users, not because they're bad, but because of the way spectrum policy has worked in the past. I wonder if you might transition and talk a little bit about that and the markets and the impact on the market potentially.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is related. I mean, federal agencies, it's a legacy of U.S. spectrum policy that for decades the FCC and NTIA gave out slices of spectrum and through BU contests said what these services would be, and we know now that's a fairly inefficient way of planning spectrum use. And the thing I like about spectrum policy is it crosses parties, it crosses industries, it crosses agencies, and which makes it, again, a fascinating area to study. And I think what some of the spectrum crunch, talks about is this misallocation, particularly to federal agencies who pay market rates for vehicles and for radios and for electricity, but they don't pay market rates for radio spectrum. And so, and they're using it. They're certainly using it for very, very valuable activities, but it is hard, again, what's the social value of that versus what could it be used for as an alternative in commercial markets? And so I've written a few papers on this subject, and it's a slow-moving area, but it is good to see. I mean, people understand flexibility is good. Agencies, because of this history, probably not using much of it well, and we should get more of it into commercial markets.
Thanks. So Dave, I'd like to talk a little bit about, speaking of beauty contests, maybe that's not the greatest transition. I'd like you to talk a little bit about CBRS. I mean, Ruckus has been a leader in CBRS, and I've heard you speak quite a bit, not just about the investments that Ruckus has been making in this kind of flexible environment, or the hypothetical proposed, hopefully, I think for you guys, flexible environment. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Ruckus's investments, and then maybe Michael, you could jump in, because I know you've done some work, obviously, from the PCAST perspective, and tell us what you're seeing as well.
Okay. Sure. I'm actually going to jump real quickly on to Brent's
You
answer.
do your thing.
Okay.
You just answer whatever question you want, Dave.
I'll try not to. No. I'm going to answer your
See,
question, I
Drew,
promise.
This is how nice Drew Fitzgerald is. You just answer whatever question you want.
Great.
Hard-hitting reporting
Yeah.
from the Wall Street
Yeah,
Journal.
it's like testifying before Congress. So,
That's
yeah,
right.
Here, let me tell you what I want to say. No, I did just want to add a little bit to what Brent said, because I fully agree with him, and he and I happened to be on a panel about opening up federal spectrum a few weeks ago here in D.C. And I think and on the panel with us was NTIA and DISA, as well as the commission. And they made the point pretty loud and clear that they're encouraged by some of the collaboration that's happened within CBRS in the context of the ESC system and sharing with the federal radar systems that are operating there, and that is, there are more calls on NTIA and the federal agencies to make spectrum available. That sharing is much more preferable from their perspective, obviously, to clearing and reallocating. So that's just something I think to keep in mind. And there's a value in not relocating somebody, right? I mean, you can just look at the money that that was raised through the investment auction in terms of, this is the amount that people needed in order to justify their relocation out of a band, out of a market. So if we can keep incumbents in a band, there's a real cost savings around that as well. So that's sort of another factor to this valuation that should be considered. And Brent probably has more intelligent things to say about that than I do. So to your question, Ruckus investment in CBRS, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, really about 3 years ago or so, we really started looking closely at what was going on in the 3.5 proceeding, and the idea that cellular-oriented spectrum that 3GPP is already designated worldwide for TDD LTE services was going to be made available in the States, and there was going to be new commercial uses around the incumbents with the SAS coordination. And the fact that you'd have both the exclusive use tier with the priority access and then the what we call permissive use at the GA tier, it seemed like that was going to solve a lot of issues that we had been observing for a while with sort of the traditional or legacy small cell approaches. So my perspective is the rhetoric has died down a lot, but over the last decade there'd been a lot of talk about licensed indoor small cells taking off, and it seemed like every year was going to be the year that it took off, and a year later we'd all look around and say, what happened? Because it hadn't. And in our opinion, much of that was related to the complexities around using licensed spectrum in building, the fact that you had to coordinate with the license holder in order to do that, to make sure you weren't interfering with their macro network outdoors, and then also the fact that there wasn't a clear multi-operator or neutral host capability for those solutions. So most venues were not going to go and deploy 3 parallel systems or 4 parallel systems to cover all of the MNOs. So the fact that you potentially could deploy this, an LTE small cell in your building, do it with shared neutral spectrum, and then implement a neutral host capability to support the subscribers of the mobile operators while also supporting your own employees or guests or whatever, IoT, private LTE, all sorts of opportunities. So we jumped in full force, set up a whole new business area around this, brought in a lot of LTE expertise, and we've got a number of, we've been conducting trials now for the last 12 months under experimentals, and really looking forward to the service getting authorized here soon.
Great. Michael,
All right.
similar question, but from a different perspective. You were there at the beginning, right? You were there at the beginning at PCAST. You've been participating with the CBRS Alliance, so this group of companies and engineers and thinkers really making business and investment commitments, it seems like, into the CBRS. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think what Dave was suggesting with Ruckus is just is just part of it. I mean, we've been incredibly impressed by the tremendous variety of different industry verticals and companies that are coming forward saying, if we had direct access to spectrum, we could deploy these local area networks, and particularly the interference protected spectrum. So that's a big, I can say something more about it later from an economic point of view, but a key factor here is we've been in this world, and this was kind of the you might call it the pre-PCAST world or pre-CBRS world, right, where licensed and unlicensed were two entirely separate realms. Different spectrum, different network, different standards bodies, everything. But as you move toward wanting, very high capacity in specific places, whether it's high traffic areas for Internet of Things, for real-time, data being generated from critical infrastructure, whatever it is, there's now becoming a demand for some interference-protected spectrum from a wide, and for private LTE networks from a wide variety of industries. So the CBRS Alliance is what, it's up to 77?
Yes.
You corrected me the other day. Sorry. Companies, that are really diverse. So we had an event a few weeks ago where with a panel representing some of them, and it's worth just ticking off a few. So the head of federal regulatory for General Electric was there to talk about, they don't usually play at the FCC, but they filed comments in CBRS because he walked through each one of their verticals, right? Whether it's electric power plants, jet engines, wind turbine farms, nuclear power plants. He said, we want real-time wireless data connectivity, for the future, because that's going to allow for all kinds of remote monitoring, SCADA, all this. But he said, this is critical infrastructure. We can't just rely only on unlicensed, and there doesn't seem to be a practical way to get that, that service from a mobile carrier, which is sort of really talking to a common denominator of needs. And then you had CBRE, which is the nation's largest property manager, 2 billion square feet under management, talking about how, and so was the person from the Hotel Industry Technology Association as well, talking about how, yeah, we have Wi-Fi, but what we're finding is that we don't have, like, you know, even 2 bars of LTE coverage inside these buildings, you know, let alone 4 bars. And so we'd like private LTE networks, and then our people all want to customize those for the Internet of Things, so they can attach their, you know, their sensors and customize it for what they want to do. And then finally, we're, of course, the rural broadband providers. You heard from Steve, last panel, WISPA, but also NTCA, the Wireless Broadband Association. We're talking about how, you know, if they had right-sized license areas, you know, small license areas, they could, you know, hit these rural households, address the rural broadband gap in general in low population density areas. They could deploy, but they can't afford gigantic traditional cellular licenses.
Great. So I want to kind of go up a level and talk generally about sharing and sort of generally about unlicensed and lightly licensed access to certain bands. And Brent, I don't want to put you on the spot, but in the past, I think you've written about the benefits of sharing and the opportunities there. You've put some cautions around it. I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about that and how it relates, hopefully, to investment.
Yeah, thank you. So, and the previous panel kind of mentioned, I mean, there's all these types of sharing, and often, you know, even at the FCC, but in the media, you see sharing. I mean, sharing covers a lot of ground. So I can share a country with someone, I can share a stake with somebody, and that's 2 very different things. And in Spectrum, you see that. I mean, so, you know, geographic sharing is well understood and fairly easy to do and has been going on for decades. Other types of sharing, you know, it gets much harder to do. So any sort of dynamic frequency, you know, on-demand frequency sharing, it gets difficult. And, you know, in 3.5, you know, I think there is room for caution on this. I mean, you can't, the FCC compares it to the TV white spaces proceeding. And if you know that proceeding, is, I mean, to say disappointment is an understatement. It's, you know, one of these companies predicted in 2012 that they'd have 100 million devices out by 2014. There's fewer than 1,000 for the entire industry. And so, you know, and there are you know, big differences, but I think with this ban, the FCC tried to make everyone happy and tried to do too much at once. Particularly, yeah, I mean, the sharing, I mean, any of these, you know, geographic sharing with federal agencies, an SAS, an automated frequency selection, 74,000 license area. I mean, any of these by themselves would be a massive undertaking for the FCC. And to do them all at once, I think they bit off more than they can chew. And hopefully, you know, my hope is they'll simplify it and induce more investment than otherwise.
Dave, I noticed you had maybe some thoughts in reaction, but maybe not.
Let me see, gathering myself here. No, I actually, you know, pretty much agree with what Brent was communicating there. You know, I think that they certainly were trying to do something new. And Commissioner Carr's words from last Tuesday at the open meeting, you know, he said CBRS wasn't about sort of the existing options they've already had in the policy toolkit for a long time. This is about creating something new. And so I guess we could have some, you know, discussion or debate about, you know, how much new is enough and maybe how much is too much. I do think that, you know, now they may be looking for some compromises here in this latest NPRM. So we'll see, you know, what comes out of that. But I do think that, you know, if we start, I'm going to go ahead and throw out, we've talked a lot about IoT. We haven't had enough conversation about 5G, so I'll just throw that out. So, as we start talking about 5G and you look at the IMT 2020 goals around, it's not just enhanced mobile broadband now, it's about ultra reliable, low latency, and it's about massive machine-to-machine. It's about network densification, it's about, very low latency and high capacity networks. And I would agree with Gabriel wherever he is that, in Ruckus's view, 5G is an umbrella of technologies, not just the 5G NR coming out of 3GPP. But that said, what it also presupposes is that you've really got a much wider range of deployment options and actual deployers and operators of networks than has been the case with the preceding Gs, right? The 2G, 3G, 4G has been a relatively small ecosystem of players. If we're going to get in-building coverage, if we're going to have extremely dense networks, both indoor, outdoor, et cetera, you're going to have to open this up to other kinds of players than frankly just the traditional mobile operators. They're still going to lead and be extremely important in driving the ecosystem, no doubt at all, but you're going to need more supporting players around them. And I think that's frankly one of the things that the Commission was trying to do, and I want to make sure that we don't lose that during this process.
Great. Brian, it's been quiet on this side of the panel, and I really want to, this is really just for my own personal edification. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process of raising capital when Starry doesn't own, you didn't go buy spectrum licenses. Well, it seems like it's going to fail. So I wonder, but apparently people, yeah, no problem. This is being live streamed too. I'm really sorry about that. But obviously there's something interesting going on here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about raising capital in that environment and maybe if you want, project to what that might mean for other players.
Sure. I appreciate that. And I'll tie in some responses to some of the stuff that's been going on here as well from a policy standpoint. So I think as a traditional matter, venture capitalists are probably loath to dump a bunch of money into fixed infrastructure projects. They're incredibly expensive to deploy. They tend to be in industries that are controlled by a few large players with substantial economic and otherwise control of a market. In our case, we were able to convince folks to give us money because we were approaching this from a slightly different perspective. One is that, as I've said a couple times, the cost of what we're trying to do is dramatically different than it is to deploy a fixed wireline network. The other is that one of the effects of that is that we don't have to get really high penetration numbers or high subscriber numbers in any given market to turn a profit because our costs are so much lower. We're really going after those, in cities to start, we're going after those MDUs, apartment buildings that lack competitive access to broadband. And while in an aggregate, a city might have really good broadband access on a block-by-block or city-by-city basis, there's surprisingly a high number of places where you can actually get a building that doesn't have competitive broadband in that building. So our numbers can be relatively low, our costs are relatively low, the technology is interesting and dynamic. And I think as a general matter, and this goes back to a point that Dave was making about the transition into 5G, I think it is absolutely true the carrier is going to invest billions and billions and drive an ecosystem that is centered around carrier-based technologies, the LTE ecosystem, the 3GPP ecosystem. But I think in 5G, there's an opportunity to add another layer on top of that, both in terms of economic development and in terms of technological innovation and service innovation for consumers, businesses, and other industrial users. I think that's really true in 3.5, and I think we'll probably see that play out. I think you see the membership in the CBRS Alliance as an example of that, the diversity of number of people in there, which is different than what was involved in white spaces. I think you see a broader array of people interested in that. But then in the high frequency, yeah,
The FCC did it. I mean, they compared it.
we built off of it.
Right.
So in the high frequency spectrum, the stuff we're using, the millimeter wave bands, there are two properties of that make it really useful for sharing in a way that doesn't really harm the carrier model. One is that there's just a ton of spectrum up there. So we're talking about tens of gigahertz of spectrum available for different types of uses. Number two is that so there's a lot of it. It's highly shareable, right? It is directional. It is millimeter wave for a reason. It goes in very narrow beams and straight paths. It doesn't go through obstacles. And we found in our own deployment, we can put in overlapping base stations and not interfere with ourselves. So there's a real opportunity to create space for other types of users to get access to spectrum in a way that doesn't come at any cost to the carrier model or the predictability or certainty or access to spectrum that they need to develop and deploy new technologies, 5G technologies and LTE-based technologies. So we're relying on shared spectrum. We think it's an opportunity. We think it's a lower barrier to access for us to get into the marketplace. And from a sort of money standpoint, if you're thinking about raising money to participate in an auction, that doesn't tend to be venture money. That tends to be people that want to invest in the upside of the spectrum, not necessarily the upside of the business that is buying the spectrum. So it's a much more difficult proposition to raise a couple $1 billion to participate in an auction than raise, $60, $70 million to develop a new technology and potentially deploy a new network.
Great, thanks. I'm going to now turn the fun over to the audience. I have a few more questions, but it looks like Mike Marcus has a question and wouldn't even wait for the invitation to come out of my mouth. So, Mr. Marcus.
One thing you weren't clear about, you use 37, 39 gigahertz spectrum. If I remember. What do you have? You have an experimental license for that? How do you expect that to be licensed or unlicensed? And if it's licensed, how will you get it?
In the current FCC rules for the Spectrum Frontiers bands, the 37 to 37.6 band is available on a shared coordinated basis, lightly licensed. The commission, unfortunately, in the next RNO that they're going to be voting on November, punts on this. There's some recons pending. There are details about how the sharing works. It's unfortunately kicking the can down the road a little bit, but that is a shared spectrum environment. And just a point on the federal access as well, that's an opportunity to really work out some federal sharing stuff. Federal guys have an allocation in the band. It's greenfield on both sides. It's fixed and mobile on both sides. Real opportunity to kind of get together and figure out how to do sharing in a robust way there.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, and it kind of loops back to what Brent said earlier too, is so certainly if you want to, we have a whole number of bands where incumbents, like the Navy in the CBRS band, right, are using the spectrum for some important purpose, but they're using very little of it, just the nature of their operation. And so a geolocation database approach, such as was approved initially for TV white space, now for CBRS, it is something new. It's something a little more complicated. It appears it's going to work well, but we'll see next year. But it's really worth being innovative in this space because it unlocks so much more bandwidth, and it's not just at 3.5 gigahertz, right? It's the same approach can be taken in 37 to 37.6, so that some of the millimeter wave spectrum is open to everybody else. And for purposes like this high capacity fixed wireless as a substitute for trenching fiber. Another place where this is will be, is enormous opportunity is in the band immediately above CBRS, right? From 3.7 to 4.2, which is the downlink portion of the conventional C-band satellite spectrum. You have, something like 4,000 to 7,000 fixed satellite earth stations, these dishes you see out in fields. You have to work around them, and CBRS, in fact, has to protect them as well using the spectrum access system. But imagine if you extend a version of the spectrum access system or even automate Part 101 coordination, you can very quickly use that for that mid-band spectrum for high-capacity fixed wireless without even disturbing the current use. And although we can dream of clearing the band for a big auction of exclusively licensed spectrum, if that's even possible, it's not for many years to come. And the good thing about the database approach, the reason it's worth playing it out and making it work, is it's going to unlock spectrum like that on a short-term basis for lots of different uses and users.
And if I could, sorry, I'd like to jump
Sure,
on other
Dave.
people's comments. And it's not just the band directly above CBRS, but actually directly below it as well. So Commissioner O'Reilly has called for early looks at 3.1 to 3.55, and specifically with a focus on 3.4 to 3.55. And again, you've got some other NTIA federal incumbents there. So he's said, if indeed clearing and repurposing isn't feasible, then, what sort of sharing paradigms might work in that band also.
Great. Other questions? Austin.
So in making spectrum policy decisions, the FCC is at least theoretically engaged in a cost-benefit analysis. And I wonder if you think the investment and types of social value you've been talking about today are really getting captured in the benefits of unlicensed in those policy-making decisions.
I'll go. So it's, cost benefit is hard, obviously, and it's hard, especially for unlicensed. I mean, we can see the social value, but the asset, the spectrum asset is not being traded in secondary markets. There's no auction, so it's like a lot of things, it's hard to estimate. I think in spectrum policy, one of the good things is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and a lot of this is converting legacy uses, whether it's government or broadcast or public safety, to flexible commercial uses, and it's unlocking that potential that allows all this value to be apportioned, unlicensed, licensed, and everything in between. So no, I mean, determining it is hard. It's especially hard on unlicensed, but I think we're going in the right direction. There's a lot of consensus on liberal licenses. Don't do beauty contests anymore. Don't just give this away to special, certain technologies. Just get it out there and let the innovators do the rest.
And I'll add to that a little bit. So before I joined Starry, I spent 5 years at the commission doing spectrum policy, so I have some experience in this. Spectrum policy is a really hard optimization problem, as Brent said. You don't know what the variables are necessarily, and even if you know them, you don't know what the values are. So it's really hard to solve for whatever might be optimal, and it's hard to even define what is optimal. I think Brent's right. It is going in a good direction where there tends to be a pretty good balance of different types of access schemes. And I think hopefully that we're moving past a point of sort of pragmatic debates between different philosophies of spectrum access, and instead trying to figure out what that right mix is, where it's not just binary, it's yes or no, it's yes, no, and maybe so in the middle. I mean, trying to find something that's a little bit more of a balance instead of sort of a philosophical debate, I think, is important.
So there have been, I think that I know of three pretty good studies trying to estimate the economic value of unlicensed, and as much as, I think, as high as $200 billion per year, but it's difficult because it's mostly not, the transactions mostly aren't monetized in the same way. For example, cellular, industry is all monetized. But I think it's also interesting, or shed some light on it, to think about that it's generally being underestimated, and it's also underestimated in the context of shared spectrum. So for CBRS, for example, this whole debate about whether, that we were just talking about, the license areas, should they be small enough so that the GEs and the rural broadband providers and, and the hotels and others, can get access to that spectrum. And it's important to think about, when we think about the value of the 4G wireless ecosystem, it's not just the mobile carriers, right? It's, if you think about the value, of 4G, it's because it incorporates Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi is carrying the lion's share of the mobile device data traffic at the edge of the network, offloading and thus relieving mobile carriers of tremendous costs. So the cellular network, right, uses the exclusively licensed spectrum for a very wide area coverage network, which is really important. But then you have Wi-Fi using unlicensed spectrum to provide more capacity and better indoor coverage. And it's that combination which really gives the whole 4G ecosystem its total value. And what the CBRS debate is about is, are we going to extend that value proposition to 5G? Because I think the 5G wireless ecosystem is going to be exactly the same, that same combination, but much more so. Because what you'll need for the things that distinguish 5G, very high, where you need it, very high throughput, low latency, the ability to connect hundreds of devices at a location, you're going to need this third layer, which is what I was talking about before about local businesses and industry verticals that can have access to spectrum to deploy localized networks for their specialized purposes, and along with Wi-Fi and along with the cellular 5G network. So it's going to be all three of those networks that end up providing the value of a 5G wireless ecosystem. But even though it's so interesting that this commission, which talks so much about cost-benefit analysis and so on, they're not recognizing anymore, as as Brian and his colleagues did in the original CBRS orders, that when you think about that 5G ecosystem and who should be deploying networks that are customized for an Internet of Things and so on, it's the local operators and businesses themselves who have access to siting, power, and backhaul, which is totally unlike earlier generations of cellular wide area coverage. What they don't have access to is interference-protected spectrum. You add that ingredient and you get that third layer, which I think is going to be essential to the value proposition for the 5G ecosystem.
So, and also to your question, so value of unlicensed, so I'm going to correct you, Michael, I'm sorry. I think the report you were thinking of was $222 billion in economic, in the value of U.S. economic activity per year, and that was as of 2013, estimated to have gone to $547.2 billion in 2017, so total value of unlicensed. And I think when that report was done, actually, again, back in 2014, Telecom Advisory Services, that was really before a lot of these IoT and unlicensed LTE services had started coming on strong. So I know on the previous panel, Rachel was talking about just in the startup scene, they're seeing $2 billion of potential investment in IoT, sort of unlicensed IoT services just next year. Ericsson, actually, in their mobility report from about this time last year, predicted there was going to be 18.1 billion IoT-connected devices by 2022, and of those 18.1 billion devices, approximately 92% of them were going to be connected over unlicensed spectrum. So I think there's a huge value in unlicensed spectrum. To your question about, sort of how do we capture this in policy, one of the things that we're concerned about is just some of the sort of more esoteric things in the law, which sort of have a background impact on policymakers and agency decisions. So things like the uses of the Spectrum Relocation Fund, which really can only be used to compensate agencies if there's a direct auction revenue that comes about from the use of that spectrum. So, wouldn't it be nice if somehow the societal value of opening up spectrum for unlicensed uses could be then compensatable if you're a federal agency. There's a report that the CBRS Alliance commissioned on the economic value of the CBRS band. It'll be coming out next month. Actually, it'll probably be coming out in the next couple of weeks. But that also finds, a very high billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar, tens of billions of dollar valuation on the CBRS band. But what's interesting is the majority of that valuation comes from the permissive uses, not from the exclusive uses.
Peter.
Well, in the midst of all this group hug over Wi-Fi here, I have to point out a certain reality in the marketplace is that, in fact, unlicensed is losing the spectrum war to 5G and IMT. That's just a reality out there. You see it in the FCC, you see it in the ITU. You look at the successes of the rulemaking and the focus of the discussion on low band, mid band, high band for 5G, and there's nothing comparable on the unlicensed side. And so the Wi-Fi community is forced into this corner of talking about shared spectrum. because that's all you have left, basically. Which is fine, because shared spectrum, I do believe, is going to be successful, and I do think is the right way to go, because it's the only way we're going to get more spectrum out there. So totally buying into that. But the concern that I have to raise, and love your feedback on, is I also see manufacturers out there, some of your panelists to come to mind, are hedging their bets and producing products that are both Wi-Fi and cellular based, that are small cell products integrated with Wi-Fi, because in part they don't have a high confidence that sufficient unlicensed Wi-Fi was going to be available in the future. 900 megahertz, saturated, went away. 2.4, saturating, going away. Won't be long before 5.8 is going to be in the same position, simply because the rate of utilization of Wi-Fi is not keeping pace with the spectrum allocation. That's just a reality right now. What's your concern that this trend is going to continue, and that the 5G, the cellular market, is going to win simply because they're going to have the lion's share of the market space, and there really won't be sufficient bandwidth for Wi-Fi in 20 years?
Well, I might save you all and give the other panelists for the next panel the time to think about this question. Because I don't know, none of the folks on this panel, your organizations, didn't sign on to that interesting 6 gigahertz filing at the FCC in the mid-band? Nope. I know. Well, Dave, I think one was, no, I'm just kidding. They're all interesting. They're all interesting. I might save this for the next panel because I think it's an interesting question. And so, Peter, if you can stay, I want you to ask it. Michael, do you want to answer it? I've lost control of this panel.
Since 1985, there's been a 902 to 928 band. And while nobody's mentioned the word halo, the Wi-Fi, if Edgar was here, Edgar would say halo. So there is halo, 902 to 928. Since 1994, there has been a band at 60 gigahertz, originally 59 to 64, then 57 to 64, and now 57 to 71, although CTIA is fighting tooth and nail over 64 to 71, but it certainly is 57 to 64 unambiguously. So to say that Wi-Fi is only the 2.4 gigahertz band sort of neglects some other actions that maybe aren't well known, but have been in place for decades.
That was a succinct answer. I don't know, Peter doesn't look convinced, so we might bring it up again on the next panel. Are there other questions? Or Dave,
Sorry.
take it.
I have
no,
to.
take it away.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to address Peter's point because, I'll let others speak to what happened with Uni2B and, 5.9. I mean, I think you're making some good points here about unlicensed availability. But as a vendor that has a history with Wi-Fi and is now developing LTE solutions, our motivation for getting into the LTE service business has nothing to do at all with our, any pessimism on our part about the future of Wi-Fi. We think Wi-Fi, is here to stay and is only going to get better. I mean, Gabriel made a lot of great points about the capabilities with AX. We do need additional spectrum. We've been a champion for that. LTE is a parallel opportunity, as Michael pointed out. There's certain use cases, especially in the industrial IoT space where, unlicensed doesn't have the predictability that people need. But, our foray into LTE has nothing to do with our confidence in Wi-Fi.
Great answer.
And hopefully you will, in that next panel, talk about 5.9 and 6 gigahertz because there is some more unlicensed spectrum in play.
Yeah, would you like to talk about it now, Michael? I'll let you have the first bite at the apple.
Well, just only that.
I'll let you set the stage for Danielle. I'm just kidding.
Okay. And I feel a bit so because Peter knows all this, and I could have said what Peter said, but and it's true that that I think for the reasons he said that unlicensed is being sort of forced to shoehorn in where it can, and so we're fighting some kind of nasty fights to be able to share bands. But at the moment, the best opportunity is to extend. So unlicensed is not just obviously it's 2.4 band is getting it probably is saturated, that's moved now to 5 gigahertz, which is good because you have wider channels and thus higher capacity in 5 gigahertz. Unfortunately, the FCC was not able to accomplish everything it proposed back in 2013 to open up 750 contiguous megahertz for unlicensed sharing in 5. In part, the military has sort of shut us down on one big part of that. And now there's another part that's still in play, and I've been hearing hopeful things just in the past few weeks about Wi-Fi, sharing the 5.9 gigahertz, the car band, where DSRC doesn't use it yet, but wants to with the help of a mandate from Department of Transportation. And then above that is what's in play in the mid-band notice of inquiry, which is 6 gigahertz from the top of this DSRC band from 5925 all the way up as high as 7125. It'll be an underlay. It'll probably involve using databases and other things that may be complicated, but it is a real opportunity to extend that, those wide channels for gigabit Wi-Fi using 802.11 AC and then AX, which will be, the 5G, the truly 5G version of Wi-Fi.
And I will just jump in with a little bit of an addition, which is to say, it doesn't seem like that battle has been lost in Europe yet, right? And the standards process has begun actually for 6, if I'm not mistaken, which is, I haven't been in this business as long as Dr. Marcus, but it seems like that's unusual. So maybe it's not as forlorn. Okay. Next question. Other questions? No. Well, folks, I'll give you maybe 10 seconds each if there's anything else you want to say, and if not.
Say tall fences make good neighbors, and that's true in spectrum policy. I think trying to force sharing in some ways, it can detract from both sides. And I think 2.4, is evident. Where you give it away to one party, it makes it much easier to share amongst users.
I like the idea of fences on wheels. So, I think flexibility in these sharing frameworks is really important. Frameworks that can adapt as use cases and demand changes over time.
For 20 years, the FCC nurtured wide area coverage networks for ubiquitous mobile networks. Increasingly, the need is not spectrum for coverage, but spectrum for capacity. And so we need much more shared and small cell spectrum, not only to squeeze more capacity out, but also to let more players in. And that will be the diverse 5G wireless ecosystem that best serves the public interest.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd also like to thank you for your patience as I did Halloween a day early as Drew Fitzgerald. And I hope this discussion has whet your appetites for our discussion later this afternoon, where we'll really dive in to some of the policy questions. But I hope you'll join us. We'll have a little bit of a break here. There's some refreshments in the back, and then we'll reconvene at 3:30. Thanks, everybody.